Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce our next speaker, Jonathan Woetzel. Jonathan is senior partner with McKinsey & Company, and probably anybody who has lived or worked or read about Asia either knows Jonathan or knows his work. He's global leader of McKinsey's City Special Practice. He's the Asia-based director of McKinsey Global Institute, which is the think tank of McKinsey & Company. He moved to Shanghai in 1995 and has been based there ever since. So he's seen a lot of change at firsthand across China and across Asia. And from there, he leads McKinsey's China business development practice. And from there, he also works across Asia. He covers the entire region and has been the author of a great many reports looking at Asia-Pacific economic trends and market opportunities. So Jonathan is one of the deepest experts we have anywhere on Asia-Pacific business, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Jonathan Woetzel to the stage.
It's great to be here. I'm going to present a little bit of very early McKinsey thinking. As Sean mentioned, I'm one of the co-directors of our Global Institute, which is an internal research organization. But we're working on a report, as it happens, on the future of Asia. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to test some of our early thinking and to get some reactions. So not too much further ado on this. The four propositions. We've always talked about Asia as being in the future. And we're here to say the Asian century is actually now. You are in it today. And that as we see this materializing, it's driven not only by consumers, and we think that's a really important story, but also by companies. And that's going to be the next wave of the story, is about the Asian company and the Asian model. Interestingly enough, we think we're also at an inflection point. And that what we're going to see from here on in is Asia is going to become more Asian. And it's going to be that much more important to understand it as an Asian as opposed to a global person. That there are some real forces here that are causing Asia to become more of itself. And finally, this is not just a China story. This is everything. This is the whole region. And it's a vast, dynamic, and diverse region. But it's all collectively moving forward. So those are the four propositions. Typical McKinsey fashion, we tell you at the beginning. But I love this because this, some people accuse McKinsey of being a little short term, so wouldn't want to be that. So this is 2,000 years of economic history. And essentially, if you took a 3D map of the world and you projected all of the economies and weighted them by distribution, you would have said 2,000 years ago that the center of the world was somewhere between India and China, roughly speaking, and more or less stayed there for a couple thousand years. There was great drama in the world, there was plagues, there was the Crusades and all sorts of other things, but it didn't fundamentally change where the weight of the global economy was, which was in those great agrarian empires. And then around about 1500, all of a sudden something happened, and the center of the world took a hard left and started to go towards Europe and then kept going, and that of course was urbanization and industrialization and the steam engine and electricity and all sorts of great things. And then notice what happens is all of a sudden it gets to somewhere close to Greenland, waves hello to the polar bears, and then starts doing the big round trip. And that, of course, was Japan, reconstruction after the war, and then it became the Tigers, and then it became China, and now you notice it's heading downwards a little bit, and that's India, and the Middle East and Africa, and so we think the center of the world, in 2025 will be somewhere close to Kazakhstan. So just a bigger picture on this, maybe what we are experiencing is a little bit of a back to the future kind of moment here. Why is that? Well, here's the biggest reason, of course, is urbanization, is that we think that there are roughly 600 global markets, and 400 of them are in emerging markets. Most of those are in Asia, and that will be most of the growth of global GDP. And this phenomenon of urbanization, of moving people from farm to factory, that is a one-way trip, first of all, and secondly, it is the unlock for productivity. Cities are essentially productivity engines. It's what happens when you jam a lot of people in a room, you don't let them leave, and you force them to interact with each other. Sooner or later, they figure out what they're good at, and they figure out what they're bad at. They stop doing the bad things, start doing the good things. It's called specialization, and that's productivity. And you have to have a city to do that. So this is a simple technology, if you will, but it's a meta technology. And it's a technology that Asia is just getting right now. So how is it getting it? Well, fun charts, right? There's Shenzhen, back when I showed up, or at least a few years after it, and that's, of course, Shenzhen today. This is not, again, just a China story, so this was KL, and this is KL today. So it's a region-wide explosion of capabilities. That's the first and the biggest reason, but it's not the only one. The second big thing that we see is the consumption revolution. I just point this out, that Asia is now the biggest consumer market on the planet. It passed North America. So if you are interested in the consumer, you have to be interested in Asia. There's no other place to look. Essentially, there are only two cohorts you're interested in: retired old people in North America and working age populations in China and India. That's what you care about. Because if you're developing the next wave of, I don't know, electric vehicle, that's who your market's going to be. They're going to be buying the product. So that's the second big factor, is the consumer story. And it's an interesting consumer. So it's a very digital consumer. For example, this shows Indonesia on the right-hand side versus the United States. And you see how much time they're spending online, largely because online works. Offline, not so much. So when the consumer wants to shop, wants to get information, wants to transact, they go online. And they go online now, and they do it much younger, and they do it for pretty much everything. So it's a different consumer. Not only is it a bigger pool of market, but it's a different consumer as well. That's the consumer story. Here's the company side. 1 out of 4 companies, almost half of the world's billion-dollar companies will be in emerging markets, and almost 50% of those, or 1 out of 4, will be in Asian markets. This just shows this number shows that back in the day, there were about 8,000 companies which had $1 billion. Going forward, I think that number is going to go up to around 15,000. Most of those, and almost all of that growth is coming out of emerging markets, and most of that in Asia. So this is the big story around the companies. Roughly today, 40% of the world's top 5,000 firms, their invested capital is from Asia. They're 36% of their NOPLAT and 39% of their revenue. So it's the single biggest region for corporations today, right now. It's not just the old companies, it's the big companies. Personally, as someone in the Bay Area, I would find this number shocking. If you look at the share of venture capital that's moved into Asia, I mean, over the last 5 years, a huge sea change. So 47% global venture capital in Asian markets right now. I mean, way up. And this is why, because you're getting a better return. I'll say that. You're getting a better return. Because it takes 6 years on average for the Asian unicorns to become unicorns. It takes 9 years for the US ones. So somehow they're scaling faster. It might be worth a look. So it's not just the companies, it's and the consumers. It's that whole region. And this is the point about Asia's becoming more Asian. This is something everybody noticed a few years back, saying, wait a second, what happened to trade? Trade seems to have plateaued, still growing, but not as a share of GDP. Why? And you go into it, and what you realize is Asia's fault. So global trade is declining because of Asia. It still seems to be doing all right, more or less, in Europe. In America, what's going on? Well, 2 things are going on. First of all, Asian markets have arrived, which means all those factories that were built for exporting, they're not exporting, they're now selling to the domestic market. China used to export 55% of its ICT, now it exports 35% of its ICT, and the total volume, of course, is 10x. So all that just says China now has a much, much bigger market, so it doesn't need it. And so that's first thing. The other thing is that before, China and India and elsewhere used to import a lot of intermediate goods because they couldn't make them. So you would have simple assembly plants in China and India. Not so much. Local content is increasing. The sophistication of the domestic supply chain is increasing a lot. As a result, the share of imported intermediate goods, the things you put into the stuff you make, is going down, the imported share. Still high, but relatively to the US, incidentally, a little bit higher than the US, but it's going down. So those are the two things that are happening. Global trade instead is going down. What's replacing it is regional trade. So regional trade, in particular intra-Asian trade, is the new trade. So when we think about Asia, it is now literally, as it used to be said, I think it was Disraeli who said it's a geographic expression, not an economic identity. Well, now that's changing. We actually start to see Asia as an economic identity, unique to itself, with its own patterns, its own flows, its own standards, and that's going to be important to understand. So here's just a small example from consumer goods, and you can see kind of all the growth in global trade in consumer goods, which is the food and beverages and textiles and toys. It's pretty much in Asia Pacific, and the colors on the right-hand side give you a little flavor for that. One of the interesting things, you see that the red means declining, so you see that big red stripe there between Hong Kong and China. That's declining. Why? Well, because China's open. So everything is going straight to China, and China is then going trading all the blue stuff, largely down to Southeast Asia. So big changes in the trade patterns, making China become, and Asia become more Asian. Here's another way of thinking about it is people flows. And so you see flows of travelers, international travelers, of migrants, of students. And as you can see, the intra-regional, or the intra-regional share, in other words, how close you go by, you're visiting your neighbors or whatever, much higher in Asia. So Asians typically travel within Asia relative to others. And so all of this just says is that this is really coming into its own, again, not only, again, as a geography, but as an economy and as a society. Last point, this is not just China. So when we look at multiple flows, you see with China, of course, is a big one. Can't duck China, but everything is moving from the 2007 to the 2017. You can see the progress, and some people moving faster than others. Fair enough. That we still have accelerating, we've got Vietnam has just taken off like a rocket. But everybody is moving along in terms of their total scale, their economy, their markets, their trade, their IP, and so forth. A couple of examples. Who won the U.S.-China trade war? Vietnam. Vietnam has very clearly won the U.S.-China trade war. Everything is great for Vietnam on this one, but it's not the only one. I mean, as you can see, a lot of other countries, and this is pre-trade, of course, this is up to 2017. This thing has just been reinforced in the last 18 months, but you can see the growth trajectory is clearly there for those other nations, and they're picking up also Chinese market share. You're going to see the fastest growing share of China imports are from Bangladesh and from the Philippines. And so it's China market finally is starting to open up at the low end. Yeah, there you go, Vietnam, Cambodia. So, and it's and this shows is an interesting map. So where are those new hotspots? You know, and they're all over. I mean, Haiphong, of course, right? Cox's Bazar, why not? Guangyang, right? I'm sure all household names here. But you know, it's of course all of those are 2 million plus people cities. They've got decent infrastructure. They've got so reliable enough power, and they have obviously the port, which is very important in this case for trade. So all of that drives a new wave of quote medium-sized Asian cities. In other words, 2 million to 5 million person cities. Again, this is all Asian scale. So that's on the trade side, and then finally on the consumer side, it looks a little different. The mega cities and the clusters of Asia are a little more prominent there. It's not so much the disparate area, but still, Greater Bangkok, what an awesome marketplace. Or you will see, around Jakarta and Indonesia, in the area, we will see, tremendous clustered growth. And so we'll also see all those patterns of growth developing as well. So I close with basically saying, it's not a question of whether Asia will rise or not, or even when. It's already there. So what are we going to do about it? How does the world respond to this new role where Asia now is the largest market, has the biggest consumers, has the biggest companies, has the biggest trade growth, and where and how to participate, how to shape that, how to be part of it, and where are the opportunities specifically. So where's the next set of Silicon Valleys? And it's not going to be one, there's going to be multiple. And who are going to be the next generation of Asian leaders? And what role will we play in being part of that Asian century? Thank you very much.
So thanks very much, Jonathan. That was a great perspective. I think we have time for a few conversations, a little question before the governor comes. When he comes, we're going to get off this stage really quickly. So you posed a couple of questions at the last slide. One is, where is the next Silicon Valley in Asia going to be? So will it be Shenzhen? You pointed to a lot of other cities on the map. So if you look ahead 5 years, more or less, where do you think those big tech centers are going to be emerging?
Well, as I said, I don't think there's going to be one. I think there's going to be multiple. Asia's more than big enough to have, 5 or 10 Silicon Valleys over a 10 to 15-year period of time. And China will have its share. I mean, I'm Shanghainese, so I have to sort of fight my corner. But no question, Beijing and Shenzhen will both have the equivalent scale. So we already see it right now. But that by no means is the is the end all. I mean, India, Bangalore would clearly qualify. I mean, in terms of the scale and the depth of the technical talent that we have there. And I would say there should be at least one or two others within India within the next 10 years. Maybe Hyderabad would also make it into that category. And then beyond that, I mean, the Southeast Asian is an interesting question. So because there's niches clearly. I mean, so we have water clusters in Singapore, and then we also, of course, in North Asia, we have a media cluster and a cultural cluster in Korea. So and then Japan already has its own version of a Silicon Valley in terms of the clustered of technology leadership that they have, in particular in components expertise with optical components or others. So that I think is. How we see it is that there will be an archipelago of Silicon Valleys, and so that's hopefully a guide to an answer. So,
great. Yeah. Your last slide also talked about networks in Asia. So to what extent do those networks predominantly run into and out of China? They're China networks, or are there networks that actually don't primarily engage China but maybe work around the region outside of China?
Well, this is very much work in progress, but I think we see, first of all, 4 different kinds of networks. I mean, there's trade and industrialization, there's a consumer network, there's a people and knowledge one, and then there's a technology network. And I think it's hard to avoid China. I mean, it's just, but I would not, first of all, I would not encourage us to think about countries. I think more about cities or clusters and and where because that's really what we're talking about. We're saying people going from place A to place B, or goods or knowledge or culture. And in that context, I mean, clearly there's a massive cultural flow through Southeast Asia and tourism. As you look at the people and you look at, again, greater Bangkok area, I would say that's a hub, and that there's a network around that. Again, I think that Korea has its own network. If we look at things like cultural exports, there's no comparison to Korea anywhere in Asia, relatively speaking. There's we've coined K-pop. So it speaks for itself. And so I think that there's no Asia-wide network that doesn't include China. I think it's fair to say. But on the other hand, there are many other hubs and there are many other flows which are independent of China, just part of that broader Asian network.
So when you think about trade, maybe 2 years ago we had the TransPacific Partnership, 10 countries plus the US, we withdrew, the other 10 went forward without us. So is that a network, because China's not part of that, and do you think that group is significant when you look at the growth of trade in the future, and do we lose something by not being part of that?
Well, we think that, first of all, being part of a trade flow is a good thing, that people who are literally in the flow grow faster. And they are more exposed to the productivity and the innovations. They get more opportunities for business development. And yes, they are more disrupted by it, but they're more capable of responding to that disruption. They have more resources. So, I mean, that's, in principle, the answer is saying, yeah, we certainly should be part of that flow. Now, this question of TPP is very interesting because, of course, Now we're sort of seeing, well, how to accommodate the new set of technologies, that growth of global corporations, digital platforms, the role of intangibles in the economy. Those were the things that TPP was all about.
Yeah.
And so we need to figure out a way of dealing with them. In the absence of that, well, it'll be catch as catch can, and so, we'll see. I mean, I think China is now thinking about joining the TPP, and they've had a bunch of discussions there, and they've clearly even started to change the IP regulations to sort of try to figure out how we can, sort of how that organization can accommodate what China as part of it. We'll see. I mean, I think it'd be foolish to imagine the world wouldn't move on without the United States in this case.
Those are really big issues you mentioned, like cross-border movement of data, really important for our companies here in Silicon Valley, and it seemed the TPP set a really good framework for that from a U.S. and a Western standpoint, and whether China can adopt those kind of standards, it's an interesting question.
Yep, absolutely.
So on your map, you talked a bit about places like Southeast Asia, these cities there in India. Maybe talk a little bit more about Southeast Asia. We've got, 650 million people, growing middle classes, a lot of energy around entrepreneurship, but a very, very connected populations, a lot of digital activity going on. So how do you see Southeast Asia growing and kind of fitting into this Asia-Pacific pattern, also from a Silicon Valley, Bay Area perspective?
Right. Well, when we say diversity in Asia, we think Southeast Asia. I mean, just the span of income, of technology availability, of urbanization, and from Laos and Myanmar to Singapore. And so that is clearly, a vast spread. But what unites it, if you will, is its differences and its willingness to work together. The Southeast Asian way, Pancasila, or the ability to sort of, let's think through how we're going to actually collaborate. And so I think that the region itself has great growth potential, driven by, again, urbanization. It's still, on average, relatively low. Obviously, Indonesia is huge, but Myanmar is coming up, and I think that there will be challenges in each of these countries that are unique to the country in terms of their racial and demographic mix, which can create a lot of diverse, challenge, as well as, of course, its access to technology and the infrastructure that's needed. But there's equally, by that point of view, equally opportunity. And again, they're in the flow. I think the main thing to think about Southeast Asia is they're in the flow. They're in the flow of what the growth that's coming out of North Asia, the growth that's coming out of China, and the growth that's going to go into and coming out soon out of India. So, I mean, they are going to be the recipient of a tremendous amount of capital, as well as, of course, technology and ports and migrants and knowledge. So it's a good bet. It's a good place to be. Mm-hmm.
So let's stay on India. Tremendous growth. A lot of reform under Prime Minister Modi, second term coming, probably more reform coming, lots of digital activity on an incredibly massive scale. And there's talk these days, the term Indo-Pacific region, kind of linking India into the broader Asia-Pacific framework. So how do you think India is going to fit into all of this?
Well, we definitely view the India story as part of the broader Asian story, in the sense that the connectivity between India and Asia will grow and grow faster than, let's say, the connectivity between that and the rest of the world. So those flows will be stronger and will grow faster. But India is also its own story, of course, and I wouldn't take nothing away from the dynamic. At the very highest level, one can see that the increase in savings, which has been translated into urbanization, which is translated into rising productivity and the growth of a middle class, those are the common elements of a story. If you will, that's an Asian story, but we would argue it's more just an outperformer story. Because I can say that story is also true in non-Asian economies. It just happens to be more true in Asia because there are more outperforming economies in Asia. So India is following the script, if you will, but it's also doing it in its own way. And it's having its own set of companies, its own technologies, and its own middle class, which will ultimately be the decider, I think, for India of how fast and how deep those markets go and how big those opportunities are.
Great. Well, I'm going to do an advertisement here. The Institute has a report being released downstairs today, 3 o'clock, on the Bay Area Silicon Valley connection to India. Anybody who wants to have an even fuller, richer day, please stay. Just move on downstairs. And then we're going to do a report coming out in August looking at Singapore and Southeast Asia. So lots to talk about there. What might be a last question, Jonathan, is if you look at this from a Bay Area Silicon Valley standpoint, so we're probably the world's leading platform economy for everything digital, entrepreneurship, technology. Companies from around the world come here to engage. We have an enormous presence from across Asia. Our companies are heavily invested across Asia. When you look at these trends you've been talking about this morning, what's the significance or what are the takeaways, do you think, for us here in the Bay Area?
Well, get on the train or the boat. So the main thing is that it is the Asian century. So I think the Bay Area, again, has deep talent and people ties to the Asian leadership, if you will, of the last decades. And I think it's now time to double down on that. I mean, that I think that the connectivity needs to be enhanced, and that's at all levels, both in terms of talent and in terms of culture and in terms of, obviously, economy and technology. And that's for the Bay Area should be, I think, relatively speaking, one of the highest, if not the highest, external priority. And external priorities need to be balanced against local issues, as always. But I'd like to think there is a win-win here, that by engaging with Asia on a more integrated way, that you will actually also have benefits for the Bay Area economy in supporting technology, supporting the economic growth, and even supporting infrastructure, for example. So.
And I would assume that for us that means looking, China's China, but looking beyond China to these other growing markets. And I would assume also that keeping the door open through trade agreements, but just through U.S. policy and what we can do here in California to the freer movement of data and people and trade is going to be important for us here.
For sure. I mean, we haven't seen anything yet. I mean, we've no question that technology, money, health, these are going to be benefits that come out of the Asian boom. Bay Area needs to get its part of that.
Great. I think we're getting the hook. Jonathan, thank you very much.
Okay.
Great.